In this video, we are going to take this example a bit more forward. So here we see that we are defining different variables like h1 username. H1 is our React element, and that is what we can see it here. And here on top, we are using React fragment to wrap multiple children into one. And at last, we are just saying go ahead and render this h1 onto our root. And that works perfectly. But what if I want to repeat this process? Say, for example, I want it 2 times. So if you do that, you'll see that it is coming 2 times, but this time I need some different information. This should be for different username. So here it is Arya and here it should be John, right? So that is what we want. So how can we make it work in such a way that we can use the same thing multiple times with multiple variables or multiple values? So for that, the simplest thing I can think about is rather than it being a variable, what if you just make it a function? Right? So you're just making it a function. Now this function can accept some parameter. So here I can say, I want to send username of the person. Like this time I'm calling for Arya, and here I'm accepting username rather than defining it here. And what if I refresh it? What will happen? So here when you're calling h1, it is going inside, becoming username, and then the same thing will happen if you refresh it. It became no one. Right, so what happened here is like earlier h1 was a variable, but now you converted it into a function, and because you converted it into a function, it became a lot more powerful. Now what if I want to use h1 function multiple times? So for that, what I'll do, I'll go ahead, define another variable called stocks. And because I'm going to return multiple children, so let's just wrap it into a fragment. And here, what we can do is we can just call this hi function multiple times. So let's just call hi once. First time I want to call it with the name Arya, but the second time I want to call it with different value like John. Right, so this is how we want it. You can call it n number of times, but right now we're just calling it 2 times. So now instead of this, we'll just say go ahead and render stocks. Save it, and what we see here in the first time, it is Lord of Winterfell. Sorry, there is spelling mistake, that's why it is happening. Let us say Arya. So now if you refresh it here, you will see that the first one is no one and second one is Winterfell, because the first time I'm calling it with the value Arya and second time I'm calling it with John. You can copy and paste it and call it with a new value like Tyrion, save it, refresh it, and you can call it multiple times. So this is the most important part of JSX. You should understand the rule, and the rule says that in curly brackets you can put any expression. We can call it with different data. Based on this, we can also change the image, right? We can pass the image from here. Say for example, we want to do that. Let's pass the image from here. Second time, I want to have a different image. So I'll just copy this image address. And so let's pass it as second parameter. We know this is going to be our first. So when we are calling Arya, we'll call this name. Similarly, so for the last one, we can just copy this image URL and paste it for Tyrion. Now we are passing the name as well as image. So here we'll go ahead and accept that as parameter. So we'll say img URL. And after doing that, here instead of just having a fixed image, what if we replace it with the variable that we are getting it from here, that is image URL. Now, what will happen when you refresh it? So when you refresh it, the first one is no one, the second is in Winterfell, third is again, and but all these 3 times we have different images. So that is the possibility that we have now. You create one function and that function can be used to do multiple things. But there is one problem here, like we were trying to be very equivalent of HTML, right? That is what we wanted. But here we see there is a problem. It is becoming more of JavaScript and less of HTML. So let's just go ahead and fix it. So in the language of React, a function that returns JSX is known as component. So this one is a component. So component is a function that returns any kind of JSX based on some parameter. Okay. Whenever you define a component, always define the name that is starting with capital letters. Let's call this component card component. So here C is starting with capital, and that is the rule. Whenever you're defining a component, start with capital letter. So now instead of doing H1, we should be doing card. You refresh it, nothing is going to change, everything is working properly. But again, the problem remains the same. It doesn't look like HTML, it looks more like JavaScript. So to fix this problem, this is how you can also call your component. You can just say card is a component, and here you can just close it like just like a normal element. So if I'll just remove this parameter from here, this is how it will look like. So when you define a component like this, you can call a component like this. So now it looks a lot more like HTML. What if you want to pass some parameters to it? So in terms of component, those things are called props, or you can call it properties. So you can pass that props like this. So I want to pass username, and that is equivalent to area here that we are passing. We also need to pass next parameter, that is image URL, and that is equivalent to this. So now you can see it here how it will look like. So this is the name of your component. Your component can have multiple props. Props are properties, but this will act like an argument. But the reason we are doing it in this way, because when you compare the arguments of HTML with this, it looks the same. So we have a card component that accepts two props or properties, that is username and image. Similarly, we can do the same for other two components. So copy paste. Here we want to say John, and instead of this image URL, we'll replace it with the new one. Similarly, let's just do it for Tyrion and change the image URL. Now we'll go ahead and delete all these parts. So now here what you're doing is you defined one component. Component is a function that accepts some parameter, and based on that returns JSX. And when you want to call your component, you can call it like a normal element. But the important thing to note is component name should always start with capital letter. Now the point is, here it can have multiple parameters, right? It can have n number of parameters. So the way components work is like they will take all this data or parameters or attributes and put it into a special object known as props. So they will give you access to props. So you'll say props, I'm going to get access to props, and inside that prop, I will have access to all the attribute that you are passing, like username and image URL. Let us make this function use a return keyword, so we will be easier to console log. So here card is a component that is accepting one parameter, that is props, and props will contain all the attributes that you're passing when you're calling the component. If you want to see, let's go ahead and say console.log. So we'll look at the value of props, but here to access username, you will have to say props.username. Similarly here, you will have to say props.image URL. Now let's refresh it. So when we refresh it, everything is working as it was. And here we can see that we are getting 3 logs. So in the first case, in props, what do we see? In props, we see the same thing that we are passing from here. Username is aria, image URL is this URL. In second case, if you look at it, we see that username is John and image URL is this. Similarly, when you look at the last one, you'll see username is Tyrion and we have image URL. So whatever number of attributes you pass to a component, that will be stored inside a special property known as props, and it will be sent to the component. That is where you can access it and use it. So in this way, we learned about a lot of things that we can do with JSX by creating component. And one thing that we learned about component is whenever you are defining a component, it should always start with capital letter. And whenever you want to call the component, you can call it like a normal HTML element. And when you're calling your component like an element, you can also pass some attributes. But in terms of component, it is known as props. You're passing some props like username and image URL. And these props are accessible to you in a special variable known as props that you get access to inside your component. And here to access username, you will say props.username, and here you will say props.image URL. Now if you look at it, the whole app is working properly, and we learned about component,